Okay? Somebody tell me something that happens during Washington's administration. Sure. So yesterday you got to hear my favorite non-Henry Clay story, which is the signing of Jay's Treaty, which leads to the really fun part, which is Pinckney's Treaty. That's the best. Can you just imagine if, like, everything you ever wanted landed on your lap and you did nothing at all to deserve it? Yeah, that'd be nice. What else happens during Washington's administration? Okay, the National Bank is created. The Whiskey Rebellion happens. What else? He issues a proclamation of neutrality in response to the French Revolution and then, like, the resulting British, like, incursion. What else? Well, actually, two parties don't happen. I think that's what you said, right? Two parties don't really happen until a bit later. So after Washington leaves office, then we see two parties form. He does. He gives a farewell address in which he gives us really great advice that we promptly ignore, like, right away. So don't get involved in foreign alliances and don't form parties. And then we immediately get involved in foreign alliances and form political parties. So good job for listening, Merca. Anybody else? Yeah, the Judiciary Act is passed, which is going to help form the federal judiciary. What else? Anybody Native American stuff? Yeah. Yeah, so the Battle of Fallen Timbers, resulting in the Treaty of Grenville. After that, trying to resolve territorial disputes with Native Americans in the American Northwest. Tecumseh actually escapes the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which is a problem for us because he goes on to lead one more big rebellion against Americans in the West. We'll talk about that when we get a little bit further. Okay, anybody else? Yep. He does. He leaves office peacefully. He leaves after 2 terms, which is a precedent that will be honored by every other president until Franklin Roosevelt, and then it's made into a constitutional amendment. Anybody else? Okay, fair enough. So you can erase those boards, and we're going to try and talk about Washington and Adams today. All right, so we're actually going to begin on the whiteboard. And I drew this during 5th period and just didn't erase it. So I'm just going to save myself the effort of walking over there in the first place, or again. But just a couple of things. So 1787 is the year in which the Constitution is written. And then, of course, we know that it will be ratified 2 years later. And in that 2-year time period, we see 2 big groups of people. They're called the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Now, tell me, what do the Federalists believe? Yeah, pretty much that's it. Yay, Constitution, right? The Federalists believe that we should ratify the Constitution. Understand, there's a lot of diversity of thought within this notion of we should ratify the Constitution, right? Because some people think we should ratify it and expand it. Some people think we should ratify it and, like, super limit it. Some people think, well, listen, I hate the Constitution, but at least it's better than the Articles of Confederation, so we might as well start somewhere. Like, there's a lot of diversity within this group of people who are supporting the ratification of the Constitution. There's a lot of diversity within this group that call themselves the Federalists. Then there are the Anti-Federalists, and they believe what? No Constitution, right? Either they're just anarchists, or they like the Articles of Confederation, or they're super states' rightsy people. They don't want the Constitution. Now, note that they are both crossed out on my diagram. That's because once the Constitution is ratified in 1789, do they exist anymore? No. So one of the biggest mistakes that I see in APUSH at this time of year is students who in their essays write about the Anti-Federalists in the time during Washington's presidency, or later on than that. But that's false. There is no such thing as an Anti-Federalist any time except for between the years of 1787 and 1789. In the same way, some of you have noticed in your vocabulary that I list separately the Federalists and the Federalist Party, right? Because that's the thing that's kind of confusing, is that when we ultimately do see the formation of political parties, one of them just happens to be called the Federalist Party. But it's not the same thing as those people who were in support of ratification of the Constitution. Certainly there are some people who were Federalists during the battle for ratification and who will later go on to join the Federalist Party, but they're not all the same people. So know that. Also note that between 1789 and 1796, Washington is the president, there are no parties. There are no political parties. It is incorrect to talk about political parties during Washington's term of office. There are none. Washington serves in a nonpartisan administration. Congress is organized by faction, but not by party, meaning that they have informal groups, but there are no recognized parties or party leadership. There are no political parties during Washington's term in office. Immediately after he leaves, they do organize in trying to contest the election of 1796. But there are no political parties during Washington's term in office. But then, upon the election of 1796, the parties do form immediately. And then we have the Democratic Republican Party and the Federalist Party. Now remember, pretty much everybody serving in national government under the Adams administration had been a Federalist, as in they supported the ratification of the Constitution, right? They're working in national government, they like the national government, they supported the ratification of the Constitution. But there are two very different philosophies about what we should do with the Constitution. There are those who are going to argue, listen, if the Constitution doesn't say we can do it, then we can't. That's called a strict or narrow interpretation of the Constitution, and that fell to which party? Yeah, that's the Democratic Republicans. They're going to say, listen, if the Constitution doesn't say we can, then we can't. So yes, they like the Constitution. Back during the days of ratification, they would have been considered Federalists. Think about James Madison. James Madison will be one of the biggest leaders of the Democratic Republican Party, but he literally wrote the Federalist Papers. So he supports the Constitution. He just thinks that it should be limited. It should be interpreted very narrowly. Then there are those in government after Adams' administration who believe, hey, listen, if the Constitution doesn't say we can't do it, then we can. Who are they? Those are the members of the Federalist Party, and they believe in a broad or loose interpretation of the Constitution. They think that the Constitution is great and we should stretch it for all it's worth. It has limits that are set into it. There are things that it forbids us to do, but so long as it doesn't forbid us from doing it, we should use the power of the government for good. So those are so everybody supports the Constitution. Remember, there is no anti-federalist party that exists in U.S. government. Everybody supports the Constitution, but they have different thoughts about how we should deal with the Constitution. So are there parties during Washington's administration? No. What is the only time in which we can talk about anti-federalists? Yeah, those 2 years when we're debating ratification, right, before the Constitution is ratified. And then we're going to see those two parties develop during Adams' administration. So that's just sort of our preview to make sure that we don't make mistakes when we're talking about who's who. So that being said, let's go on, maybe, and talk about Hamilton and Jefferson. So, yeah, there we go. So Hamilton and Jefferson are part of Washington's cabinet. Somebody tell me, what's a cabinet? People that advise the president. It's not in the Constitution. Washington made this up. He was like, I feel like I need more help. So he made up the cabinet, and he's Washington. He can do what he wants. Every other president has followed suit. So he names Alexander Hamilton to be the Secretary of the Treasury, and he names Thomas Jefferson to become Secretary of State, and then he has one more cabinet office. You have the Department of War, and he names Henry Knox. So Henry Knox becomes the Secretary of War. Now, what's the job of the Secretary of State? Yeah, foreign policy, dealing with other countries, which seems like a really important job. You know, we're a brand new country. We really need other countries to respect us, and it is pretty important. But the thing is that in Washington's administration, we are a tiny, weak, pathetic little excuse for a country. And other than Britain kind of pooping all over us, you know, and like ignoring our needs and desires, we don't really have a lot of foreign interaction. So Jefferson's job, although it sounds really important, doesn't turn out to be nearly as big of a deal as Hamilton's job. Now remember, Hamilton's Secretary of the Treasury, so he's going to be in charge of what? Money stuff, right? And if you'll recall, what was the biggest failure of the Articles of Confederation? I know, it didn't have enough power, but why was that a failure? What was the big breakdown? it's money, right? It's taxes, it's failure to pay debt, failure to regulate the economy, failure to control the value of currency. It's money. The economy is really the disaster that causes the Articles of Confederation to fail. So yeah, there's Shays' Rebellion, but Shays' Rebellion ultimately was a money thing, right? The farmers were in debt and they weren't receiving their pay, and so like the economy is the real failure of the Articles of Confederation. So fixing the economy is really the big job. So Alexander Hamilton is going to have a huge amount of power as Secretary of the Treasury, because really it's his job to try to save the economy in some way. And he was a great man for the job. He was incredibly well read and had a great understanding for the way the economy worked. But he is going to exercise a tremendous amount of power, probably needed to do so, right? We have to save the economy, so we don't want to villainize Alexander Hamilton, but for sure he's going to take on an immense amount of responsibility. In fact, occasionally he went a little overboard and talked about his administration as opposed to Washington's administration. So he's a little bit of a character. Anyway, so somebody tell me about the difference between Hamilton and Jefferson. I mean, obviously they're both like rich old white guys, but how are they different? Don't talk about party, because do parties exist? Nope. Wait, what? Okay, foreign policy-wise, sure. So especially after the French Revolution occurs, we're not even really paying attention so much in the first few years. But then once the French Revolution sort of gets into full swing, there's a really big deal about, like, what are we going to do with the French? Because the thing is, we kind of promised the French that we would, support them anytime they needed help. They did, after all, save us the American Revolution. So we had signed a treaty with the King of France shortly after the American Revolution that we would honor this alliance with the French going forward. But as the song from the musical goes, his head is now in a basket. So if he's not alive anymore, this king, for us to honor our treaty, should we jump in and support the French? I don't know. I mean, we're kind of a weak and tiny, pathetic little country as it is. We don't really have the resources to fight in some foreign war, even if we could be of any help. And also, this conflict between the British and the French doesn't really concern us. And also, the French are like losing their minds, you know? I mean, it started pretty good, this French Revolution thing, and then it got really bloody really fast. And so there's this sort of hesitation, like, I don't even know if there's a government there for us to, like, support anyway. So, but Jefferson and those like him really saw in France, first of all, this obligation, right? The French helped us, we need to help them. And then this really sort of shared identity, or this kindred spirit. You know, like Jefferson's own words are echoed in the Declaration of the Rights of Man, right, like in this French document that starts the Revolution. The French Revolution is meant to, and in some ways goes further than the American Revolution in terms of like dealing with the problems of inequality. So there is this sense that like they're fighting against monarchy just like us. They're trying to create this new, Republican experiment just like us. We should support them. But then there are the Hamiltonians of the world who are going, you guys are nuts. France is a cautionary tale. This is like what happens when democracy goes wrong. We don't want to get too close to them because they are volatile. They have no idea who's in charge. They might give ideas to like the poor masses of our country. We don't want a French Revolution here. Thank you very much. We're not interested in the guillotine. And in fact, Hamilton and those like him would have much preferred to improve our relationship with the British. And remember, the British and the French, for some reason, are sworn enemies for all of history until World War I, and it's a long story. Anyway, so like supporting the French would inherently distance us from the British. Like there's no other way about it. The British see the French as their enemies. So Hamilton is saying, listen, we have nothing to gain from supporting the French, and we'd be much better off if we cozy up to the British because it's their economy that we really want to emulate. It's their economy that we really want support from. So there is a big foreign policy conflict between the two. Okay, great. What else? Well, it's true. In terms of interpreting the Constitution, Hamilton is going to be an early believer in this loose constructionism. We should stretch the power of the Constitution, whereas Jefferson is going to be much more of a strict constructionist. No, the national government's great. We're glad we have it, but it must be limited. There are just a few things it should do. What else? Yeah, their vision for American greatness is very different. So Jefferson looks at America and he says, look, what makes us awesome is what sets us apart from the Europeans. And that is really our our abundance of land, and our ability to be self-sustaining. He calls it the agrarian ideal, and he says, you know what, the future of this country is when everyone can be a farmer and we can sustain ourselves, we produce all of our own stuff. This is what's going to make us great. No one will ever be able to threaten us because we're always going to be able to take care of ourselves. So we're going to have this, and he looks at like this, this small family farmer as being the epitome of the American spirit. You know, you're independent and you're working hard and you're, contributing to the economy and so on. So he just, everything about this notion of small family farmers, Jefferson thinks is wonderful. He actually owns a plantation. So it's not like small family farm is a thing that he personally participates in, but that's like where he sees the future of America. But Hamilton disagrees. Hamilton says, no. The future of this country is in building an economy like Great Britain. Great Britain isn't the greatest power in the world for nothing. We may have beaten them, but they're way more powerful than we are. They have truly an industrial economy by the end of the 1700s. The British began their industrial revolution in the 1730s. It's certainly still growing. They have a long ways to go, but they are miles ahead of us. They actually have a factory system. They've begun the use of steam power, all of those things. And they're much more efficient, and they can beat us basically at everything. So in terms of like if they're going to sell a product and we want to sell a product, they're always going to be able to sell it for cheaper, even having to ship it across the ocean because they have these incredible advantages in terms of efficiency. So Hamilton says we need to be more like them. He called it a commercial economy, but he was thinking of an industry, like we need to build up our manufacturing industry, and that's where our country is going to be great. We have to compete in that way. What's your question, Jim? Well, Hamilton is actually an immigrant. He's from an island in the Caribbean called St. Croix, and he comes to the U.S. Right before the American Revolution. He lives in New York, but doesn't exactly. So he grows up as he was super, super poor, but he worked in like a trading post, like buying and selling goods. It's part of where he got his early economic expertise. But anyway, Jefferson grew up in Virginia. And was a son of a plantation owner and owned his plantation himself. So they do have sort of different background in that sense. Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts about the differences between Hamilton and Jefferson? Their age. Yeah, Hamilton is younger, but Jefferson isn't as old as you would think. And yeah, the National Bank, we can get into some more policy differences. But so ideologically speaking, they have different visions for America. They have different ideas about who we should support in foreign policy. They have different ideas about how we should interpret the Constitution. So all that's really important. So we talked a little bit about this already. Again, the Hamiltonians are going to say, no, the French are losing their minds and their heads, literally, and we should support, we should get cozier with the British. Whereas Jeffersonians are going to say, no, these are our friends. So we've done that. So interestingly, when the French Revolution breaks out, again, we're asked to support the French because right after the French Revolution, the British sort of smell blood and begin to attack the French, right? So we see another British-French conflict break out. So the French are asking for our help. And Washington is getting advice from Hamilton and Jefferson. Ultimately, Hamilton will convince him. And Washington issues his Proclamation on Neutrality. I want to help you understand. The Proclamation on Neutrality is not a narrow document. It doesn't just say we will not get involved with France. It's a much broader sentiment that argues that we should not get involved with other countries unless we have something specific at stake. So we shouldn't form alliances just because when we do, that's going to pull us into some conflict we have no interest in. Why do we care what happens between the British and the French? We have no interest in that. So an alliance with the French is not in our interest. What can we possibly gain from that? He says, rather, the only time we should get involved in foreign policy is if somehow we are drawn directly into a conflict. I'm thinking a little bit further into the future, Jefferson will get us involved in the Barbary Wars. It's like pirates in the Mediterranean. That we were directly drawn into that conflict, right? So this foreign conflict is now going to concern us. So Washington would have said, yes, that's a great foreign conflict to get involved in because we have a stake. But Washington would say we should not just make an alliance with someone just because that will draw us into conflicts. It's kind of like thinking about, in the post-Cold War era, if you remember that from world history, the U.S. is in this big alliance with NATO, and then with CETO, and what happens? Well, we get involved in a lot of conflicts that because the Russians mess with one of our allies, that the Russians never mess with us directly. Washington would say we wasted a lot of effort there. I'm not sure I would agree with him all the time, but anyway, that's the argument. But there's an interesting story to be told here about Edmond Guenet. So he is the French minister to the United States, his ambassador, basically. And although Washington issues this proclamation of neutrality, Guenet, before Washington issues the proclamation, Guenet decides to sort of take things into his own hands. He goes to like American ships and like tells them they are authorized to stop British ships and like seize goods, basically telling American sailors to like commit acts of war. He like starts recruiting people for the French army. Like he does all kinds of stuff. Remember, Washington has yet to say anything. So Washington is furious, and even Jefferson is horrified because Jefferson, although Jefferson wants to help the French, understands that Guenet has gone like way out of bounds here. You're not allowed to do this as an ambassador. You had no permission, no authority. You shouldn't have done this. So they both kind of give him a dressing down. Guenet is stripped of his post. He's not allowed to be the ambassador anymore, or the minister anymore. But instead of going back to France, he decides that he'd rather stay in America. So he just like gives up on being French and is like, I'm going to stay here. And he becomes an American citizen. So he's citizen Guenet. So anyway, Mirka? Okay, so let's talk now about, do you have a question? Go. Let's talk now about Hamilton's three-point plan. Guys, go. I'm not going to stop for you. What are the parts of Hamilton's plan? Okay, he wants to create a national bank. Why does he want to create a national bank? To regulate the economy, specifically what about the economy? Yep, money, currency, right? So we can print currency all we want to, but without a bank to be able to regulate not only this of like how much is printed, but also to be able to control things like what are the interest rates and how much money is loaned, things like that, that a bank is really necessary. Why was that controversial though, this national bank that he proposed? Yep. Well, no, merchants aren't particularly hurt. It takes power away from someone, though. The states, right? The states previously had their own banks. Remember that one of the things about the Constitution is that that under the Articles of Confederation, all the states had made their own money. And so now under the Constitution, only the national government can make money. So that's a big step up. But the states still had their own banks. And so they were able to like decide if they wanted to have like inflation in their state, or if they wanted to try to have a really tight money policy. They had control there. So it's going to take power away from the states. But that's not the only reason it's controversial. Well, we'll get to that later. Jefferson believes that it's not constitutional. Because where in the Constitution does it say the power to make a national bank? Well, it doesn't. It does say we have the power to coin money and to raise taxes and to borrow and so on. And so Hamilton points to the elastic clause, the necessary and proper clause, which says Congress has all these listed powers plus everything necessary and proper to do them. So Hamilton says, listen, we can raise taxes and coin money and so on, therefore it's necessary and proper that we should have a bank to effectively regulate all those things. But Jefferson says, no, it's not in the Constitution, therefore that's a right of the states. It might be convenient to have a bank, but it is not necessary. And so therefore we shouldn't have it. So there's this big constitutional debate over the bank. Ultimately, Hamilton convinces Washington and Congress, and the national bank will be created. But it is a pretty significant constitutional battle. And it's that strict versus loose constructionism thing at work in this debate over the bank. Okay, what's next in the Hamilton's plan? Something else in his plan. Okay, so he wants to put a tariff. What's a tariff? Yeah, a tax on imports, right? A tariff is a tax on imports. Now, a tariff can be just another tax, and what's usually the point of a tax? To get money, right? To raise money for the government. But Hamilton had a very specific kind of tariff in mind called a protective tariff. So what's a protective tariff? Yeah, so rather than just have its purpose as making money, its purpose is to make foreign goods look more expensive so that we will be more likely to buy American goods. And why would we want to do that? Who does it protect? American industries. We encourage people to buy American. So for a stupid example that could not possibly have happened in the 1790s, if Britons make t-shirts, they have factories in a more developed economy than we do, so they're going to make them way more efficiently. So they'd say they can make t-shirts and sell them in America for $5 each. But Americans are still working in the cottage industry system. We don't have factories. We don't have a textile mill. So our t-shirts, when we make them, cost $10 each. Well, who are you going to buy the t-shirts from? A British t-shirt and an American t-shirt? you're buying the British t-shirt. It only costs half as much. But if we institute a protective tariff, which generally is higher than what's called a revenue tariff, which is one just meant to make money, a protective tariff will be higher. If we place a protective tariff on that British t-shirt, now it costs $10. We double the price effectively of the British t-shirt by raising this high tariff on it. Well, then now you've got a $10 British shirt, $10 American shirt. The Americans now have a chance, right? Maybe you make an $11 British shirt, whatever it is. So now the American industries are going to be selling more shirts, which will get them more profit. Then they can make a capital investment, build new technology, expand, whatever. It's going to help American industry. But how is everyone affected? Everyone has to pay a higher price. You used to be able to get a t-shirt for $5, and now you have to pay at least $10. So like everyone pays higher prices. But the idea is to encourage American industry. Yes?
He was so like, stuff like that. Why did he want to align with Britain so much?
Well, because he's going to argue, I mean, like any good economist would, that even as we build our own industry, we're going to need technology from them. We're also going to need a trading partner with them in terms of like, we won't be able to make everything, so we can trade them with them for some things and vice versa. He's also just going to talk about like the competitive advantage in terms of like we would rather have them as our friends than our enemies. So that's kind of his argument. Now, this revenue or this protective tariff that Hamilton is suggesting, it is so controversial that it doesn't pass because Congress can't stomach the idea of charging everyone, meaning making everyone pay, in this case higher prices, in order to benefit what is seen as only one small segment of our population, manufacturers primarily in the Northeast. Now Hamilton argued vociferously against them. He goes, you guys are crazy. If we build up manufacturing, then that's going to be better for the American economy. We're going to have higher wages. We're going to have more places that you can trade. We're going to have a population growth. We're going to be able to see more opportunities for all of your goods to be sold. It's good for everybody, but the Congress doesn't buy it. So sometimes students get mixed up. You think that the most controversial thing was the bank. It was really controversial. There was a big constitutional showdown over it. But the bank passes. The protective tariff does not. Congress is not ready to do that in the 1790s. And then finally, what's the last piece of Hamilton's plan? Well, so more taxes, but the last big chunk, you're not wrong. It's about debt. And the plan on debt actually has two pieces. We call it funding and assumption. So the piece on debt includes two pieces. It's funding and assumption. So the first piece is funding, and what it means is that we're going to fund the national debt at face value, or we're going to pay the national debt at face value. The debt was really big, right? From the Revolutionary War, from the times of the Articles of Confederation, we had lots of national debt. And there were many who were arguing that we just would never be able to pay it, so we should just, if we have $1 million debt, we should just print $1 million bill, hand it to the creditors, say, congratulations, we paid you off, and be done with it. But why is that a problem? Okay, everybody says that, but that's not true because it's not printing money for our economy, so it doesn't actually affect our money supply. So it wouldn't hurt our inflation, but it's credit. Because, June is my creditor. He's loaned me all this money. I decide I'm going to print him a $1 million bill and hand it to him. He is very unhappy because I've given him a worthless piece of paper and told him it's going to pay off his debt. Is he ever going to loan me money again? And June's friends over there, are they ever going to loan me money again? No, so Hamilton says we have got to protect our national credit. If other people if creditors don't trust that they will get paid back, we will never get credit again. And Hamilton believes that debt is really important for a country. First of all, because it will allow us to expand, so we can make capital projects that we need to. But perhaps more importantly, Hamilton says debt is good because, I'll use a modern example. People sometimes freak out that they are the largest foreign owner of our debt. And sometimes people get panicky about that, but it's actually nothing to panic about because why? Does China want us to fail? No, they want us to succeed. So long as they have any hope that we're going to continue making payments on our debt, they will do anything they can to make sure that the United States doesn't crash and burn. Kind of like if you invest in somebody's business, like you give them a loan to build up a business or something, you want them to win. You want them to be successful. You're going to help them advertise. You're going to tell all your friends to go to this business because you don't get paid back if they're not successful. So the second part of the reason Hamilton likes debt, besides the fact that we can use it to build our economy, he says it's good because it will give other countries an interest in America. It will give rich people an interest in America, and we need all that support we can get. But the other half of the debt plan is the assumption half. What are we assuming? The state's debts, right. So of course there's a national debt, but also the individual states had incurred debt during the Revolutionary War. Why would Hamilton say that we should assume the state's debts? Okay, so they could hurt American credit if they don't pay their debts in full. That's an initial problem. What else? But Hamilton wouldn't have seen that as a problem. Well, he just wants unity, right? I mean, like, what if you're, $10 in a hole in your cafeteria account? And I'm like, hey, don't worry about it. Let me pay it off for you. Just go get lunch. Don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. Well, now you sort of feel a kindred spirit, You might feel like you owe me, and even if I say you don't have to pay me back, you might feel like at least like you want to work harder for me, or you want to bring me a nice Christmas present, or whatever it is. You feel this sort of sense of shared goal or shared perspective. So the idea is, remember, this is a brand new government, right? Like, we look at it thinking like the Constitution has been and always has been. But remember, it's brand new. And the states were still not very well unified. So Hamilton is arguing this is one way to help bring the states together, is that if we take on their debts, they're going to feel like they actually belong to this national government. They're going to have an interest in the national government. But not all the states were happy about it. Why were the southern states unhappy? Because they already paid their debt. Remember, the Revolutionary War was primarily fought in the Northeast. There were some skirmishes in the South, but not nearly so much as in the North. It was much less costly. Also, the southern states have a large export economy, right? Even after the war and everyone else's economy is hurting, they're exporting cotton and making a fairly tidy profit. So the southern states were able to pay off their debts almost entirely. So most of them had completely paid them off. So why would the southern states be mad then about this assumption policy? Yeah, now they're going to have to contribute through their tax dollars to help pay off debts that other states weren't able to pay off. That seems frustrating. So this was also pretty controversial, but again, Hamilton's going to get it through with a big compromise over where to put the capital. But anyway, those are 3 parts of the plan. So I want you to take about a minute now and just check your notes, and here's what I want you to look for. So you might check over and make sure you've got pretty good notes about the differences between Hamilton and Jefferson, and also like the development of political parties. But especially this last chunk, I want you to make sure that you can articulate for each piece of Hamilton's plan, why does Hamilton say it's a good idea? And then who would oppose it? Like, what was the controversy about it? So check and make sure that you've got good notes. Feel free to talk at your tables to verify with one another if you'd like. A lot. There's an online calculator, but it's pretty inaccurate. I mean, it does the best it can, but because goods are so much different and technology is so much different, it's really hard to make an accurate inflation measure, but a lot. I mean, at that time, to buy a slave would be a couple $100, and that's like the equivalent of buying like a bulldozer or some like huge capital investment. Yes, in the beginning. All right. So let's pick back up here. We've got just about 5 more minutes left in class. So let's see what we've got. So we're pretty good about Hamilton's plan. Any questions at this point? Anything you want me to clarify so far from your notes? We're just going to see if we can do a little bit of Adams here. So we've already talked about Washington. And of course, the Whiskey Rebellion, we know how that ends, right? Washington swoops in. The Whiskey Rebellion evaporates. Yay, America. Of course, this is kind of Hamilton's fault because of that tax thing, but all right. Remember, Hamilton is focusing on us just making some money, so he's not quite so worried about people who wouldn't understand. We talked about, in the warm-up, a little bit about the Native American problem on the western frontier. I just want to remind you, why were the Native Americans so upset here in the Northwest Territories? Well, right, but we always take all their land, so why was that a surprise to them? Like, why did it seem unfair? Because prior to the American Revolution, what? I mean, the British had controlled that territory, but the British had made treaties, right, and signed agreements with the Native Americans that the Northwest Territories would be there, that we wouldn't send colonists in that area. So then when after the Treaty of Paris 1783, when America now, the United States takes over this land, we don't honor those treaties. We're like, no, we want this land. So the Native Americans feel particularly put out, like that they used to have this land was protected, now it's not. So they fight against the Americans. We're pretty upset about it because, remember, the British haven't abandoned all of their forts in now American territory. And even when they sort of leave some of their forts, we have this pretty strong sneaking suspicion that the British are supplying the Native Americans who continue to attack American settlers. So they have a lot more guns and ammunition than we would expect them to have after the British had been gone for so long. They have a lot of food resources that we wouldn't expect them to have, like in hard winters. And so there's fairly strong suspicion that the British are supporting the Native Americans as the Native Americans continue to attack American settlements. So that's just kind of keep that in mind, because it's part of why we get in the War of 1812. It has to do with this sort of conflict. Anyway, so we send the army, and we defeat most of the Native Americans at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. We sign the Treaty of Grenville, which kind of solves most of those problems. But don't forget that Tecumseh escapes, and he's going to come back to fight another day. We'll talk about him later. Okay? All right, so we talked about that. We did Jay's Treaty and Pinckney's Treaty yesterday. So now we'll do 1796. So here's a little fun tidbit. I told you that Washington had no party, right? It's true, Washington had no party. But, yeah, Pinckney's there. When do we hold elections in America? Every 4 years, but when? In November, okay? And these days, in the era when information travels literally at the speed of light, how long does it take a candidate to get organized to run for national office? Yeah, like 18 months at minimum, like they start campaigning a full year and a half at least before the national election will be. Do you want to know when Washington announced that he would not run for re-election in 1796? September 1796. So as a result, was there any way that any opposition could get organized to oppose him? No, there was not. And so it was pretty clear that John Adams was going to become the next president because he had Washington's support. Washington says, endorses him, and the opposition has no time to get organized. Although Jefferson does remarkably well, considering. Anyway, but of course, so how does the Electoral College work according to the original Constitution? Yeah, every elector casts 2 votes for president, and whoever gets the most votes becomes president, and the second most vote becomes vice president, which makes perfect sense if you have no parties, right? Because you wouldn't, that would be, cool, work together, be friends. But when you have political parties who want to have a president and vice president who agree with one another, this becomes more of a problem. But in fact, John Adams ends up the Federalist Party president of the United States, and Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, becomes his vice president. It goes over about as well as you think it would. They hardly ever speak to one another. Jefferson is basically ostracized from the White House. No, that's not the White House, from the presidential suite. And Jefferson will go on to write a really, really scathing document called the Kentucky Resolution in opposition to the Adams administration. So it doesn't go over that well. Don't worry. We're going to have one more failed election, and then we're going to write a constitutional amendment to try to solve this mess. So anyway, there we go. Okay, we've done that. So Adams is president. Oh, I have 1 whole minute. We'll finish here. Adams is president, and you know about the quasi-war and the XYZ affair. We talked about that already. So I just want to finish up with one more bit of political commentary. I told you yesterday that the quasi-war was really hugely political. Remember that the Federalist Party, controlled primarily by Alexander Hamilton, sees this quasi-war as an opportunity to gain strength. I mean, it's not pretty to say it, but wars tend to do very good for the popularity of the person in charge, and so there was this sense that this would be an opportunity for the Federalist Party to grow. But although Adams agrees to build up the Navy because it's sort of his pet project, he chooses in the end not to declare war, instead to send a new set of ambassadors back to France and try to negotiate a better ending. It works, but Hamilton is hugely offended. We still have a few minutes here, so you don't have to rush away. Hamilton is hugely offended because he thinks that Adams has squandered an opportunity to build support. As a result, Hamilton is going to go against Adams. I mean, Hamilton can't run for president, but Hamilton is going to oppose Adams.
Ignore that bell. We will release based on our pep rally schedule. Please see your email. Thank you.
He's going to undermine Adams in the election of 1800, which is part of why Adams does not win re-election. So we'll start there, and we'll pick up with the rest of Adams' presidency next week.